The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion glittered under television lights as Hollywood's elite gathered for the 46th Academy Awards on April 2, 1974. Al Pacino sat in the third row, his hands folded in his lap, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. At 34, he was nominated for Best Actor for his performance as Frank Serpico, the honest cop who'd risked everything to expose corruption in the NYPD. It was his second Oscar nomination in 2 years, following his supporting actor nod for The Godfather, and the industry was beginning to whisper that Al Pacino might be destined to be always a bridesmaid, never a bride. The ceremony had been progressing with the usual mix of glamour and tedium that defined award shows. Musical numbers, acceptance speeches, and the carefully orchestrated celebration of an industry that took itself very seriously. Al had applauded politely when other winners were announced, maintaining the gracious demeanor expected of nominees who understood that losing was part of the process. But losing was becoming a familiar feeling. The previous year, he'd been nominated for Best Supporting Actor for The Godfather and watched Joel Grey win for Cabaret. Tonight, he was up against Jack Lemmon for Save the Tiger, Art Carney for Harry and Tonto, Albert Finney for Murder on the Orient Express, and Dustin Hoffman for Lenny. All respected actors, all worthy competitors, but Al felt in his bones that Serpico represented something special, a performance that had required him to risk his safety and sanity to portray a real man's struggle against institutional corruption. The Best Actor category was scheduled to be presented by John Huston, the legendary director whose gravelly voice and commanding presence had made him one of Hollywood's most respected figures. But as the show progressed, there had been a last-minute change. Huston had been replaced by David Niven, the suave British actor whose wit and charm had made him a favorite presenter for major award categories. Al shifted slightly in his seat as the ceremony moved toward the Best Actor presentation. Around him, other nominees tried to project confidence while cameras captured their every expression for millions of viewers worldwide. The ritual was familiar but never comfortable, sitting in judgment while pretending that the outcome didn't matter, maintaining dignity while privately hoping for validation that might never come. And now, announced the ceremony's host, presenting the award for Best Actor, Mr. David Niven. Niven walked to the podium with the elegant confidence that had defined his career, his silver hair perfectly styled, his tuxedo immaculate. At 64, he represented old Hollywood sophistication, the kind of actor who could deliver cutting observations with such charm that victims often didn't realize they'd been insulted until much later. The nominees for Best Actor, Niven began, his British accent lending authority to the familiar ritual, are Art Carney for Harry and Tonto, Albert Finney for Murder on the Orient Express, Dustin Hoffman for Lenny, Jack Lemmon for Save the Tiger, and Al Pacino for Serpico. As each name was announced, the camera found the nominee, capturing their composed expressions for posterity. When Al's name was called, he managed a slight smile and nod, the kind of gracious acknowledgement that award show protocol demanded. Niven opened the envelope with theatrical precision, his eyes scanning the contents before looking up at the audience with a slight smile that suggested he was preparing to deliver more than just a winner's name. And the Oscar goes to, Niven paused, his timing perfect, Jack Lemmon for Save the Tiger. The ballroom erupted in applause as Jack Lemmon stood from his seat, his face showing genuine surprise and emotion. Al joined the applause, maintaining his composed exterior while processing the familiar sting of recognition that wouldn't come. This was his second nomination, his second loss, and the beginning of what would become a long and frustrating relationship with the Academy Awards. But as Lemmon made his way to the stage and Niven prepared to present the Oscar, something unexpected happened. Instead of simply handing over the award and stepping aside, Niven lingered at the microphone, his expression shifting to something that might have been amusement. "You know," Niven said, his voice carrying easily through the PA system, "it's interesting to see the same faces nominated year after year. Some actors seem to collect nominations the way other people collect stamps." The comment drew scattered laughter from the audience, though several industry veterans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't typical award show banter, this felt more pointed, more personal. "Take our friend Al Pacino," Niven continued, his tone remaining conversational but carrying an undertone that made Al's stomach tighten. 2 nominations in 2 years, both for playing essentially the same character, the intense, brooding outsider who shouts at corruption. The laughter was louder now, and Al could feel cameras focusing on him, capturing his reaction for an audience of millions. He maintained his composed expression, but his hands clenched slightly in his lap. "I suppose when you find a formula that works," Niven shrugged theatrically, his timing perfect, his delivery devastating. Though one does wonder if the Academy is nominating the performance or just the volume. The comment landed like a physical blow. This wasn't gentle ribbing or affectionate roasting, this was a direct attack on Al's artistic credibility, delivered in front of his peers and broadcast to the world. Several nominees looked uncomfortable, recognizing that Niven had crossed a line from entertainment into cruelty. Al felt his face flush, but he forced himself to maintain his smile, knowing that any visible reaction would become part of the story. Years of dealing with critics had taught him to control his initial responses, but this felt different, more personal, more deliberately destructive. "But don't worry, Al," Niven said, looking directly at him with mock sympathy, "I'm sure there will be other opportunities to lose gracefully. After all, practice makes perfect, and you're certainly getting plenty of practice." The audience's laughter was now mixed with uncomfortable silence as people began to recognize that they were witnessing something beyond typical award show humor. This was public humiliation, delivered with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly how much damage his words could inflict. Al's smile never wavered, but something behind his eyes had changed. The cameras captured it, a subtle shift from gracious disappointment to something harder, more focused. Those who knew him well would later say they recognized the expression from his most intense performances, the moment when a character decided that enough was enough. As Niven finally handed the Oscar to Jack Lemmon and left the stage, Al continued to applaud, his expression unchanged. But inside, something was building, not anger, not hurt, but the kind of controlled intensity that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. The ceremony continued with other presentations and performances, but Al's mind was no longer on the show. He was thinking about David Niven's words, about the laughter they'd generated, about the millions of people who just watched him be dismissed as a one-note actor who collected nominations like participation trophies. As the show moved toward its conclusion, Al began planning what he would say when the cameras stopped rolling and the real conversations began. Because David Niven had just made the mistake of attacking not just Al Pacino the nominee, but Al Pacino the artist, and that was a line that couldn't be crossed without consequences. The ballroom was still full of applause and celebration, but Al Pacino was already preparing for a different kind of performance, one that wouldn't require a nomination or a vote, just the courage to defend his life's work against someone who'd confused cruelty with cleverness. As the final awards were presented and the ceremony drew to a close, Al remained in his seat, composed and patient, waiting for the moment when the real show would begin. As the ceremony concluded and the orchestra played the traditional exit music, Al Pacino remained in his seat while most of the audience began moving toward the exits and afterparties. He watched David Niven work his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations for his witty presentation, his performance as the charming British sophisticate who delivered cutting observations with such elegant cruelty. Al stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled, and began making his way toward the backstage area where winners, presenters, and other industry professionals gathered for photographs and interviews. He moved through the crowd with purpose, his expression calm but his eyes carrying the kind of focused intensity that had defined his most memorable performances. The backstage area was buzzing with the usual post-ceremony energy. Winners clutched their Oscars while being shepherded between photo opportunities and press interviews. Presenters mingled with guests, accepting praise for their performances on stage. The atmosphere was celebratory, filled with the particular energy that came after Hollywood's biggest night had concluded successfully. Al found David Niven near the press area, surrounded by a small group of entertainment journalists and industry executives who were laughing at what was presumably another witty observation. Niven held a cocktail in one hand and gestured expressively with the other, clearly enjoying his role as the evening's most quotable presenter. As Al approached the group, conversations began to quiet slightly. Several people recognized the significance of the moment. The nominee who'd been publicly mocked was approaching his mocker, and everyone present understood that whatever happened next would become part of Oscar history. "David," Al said, his voice carrying easily through the backstage noise, "I wanted to thank you for that introduction." Niven turned toward Al with his characteristic smile, perhaps not yet recognizing the controlled danger in Al's tone. "Al. My dear fellow, I hope you didn't take any of that personally. Just a bit of harmless fun, you understand." "Harmless fun," Al repeated, the words carrying a weight that made the surrounding conversation stop entirely. "Is that what you call reducing 20 years of work to a volume joke in front of 50 million viewers?" The group around Niven had gone completely quiet, sensing that the polite veneer of post-ceremony celebration was about to be stripped away. Several journalists reached for their notebooks, recognizing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Niven's smile flickered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Come now, Al, surely you can appreciate good theater when you see it." The audience loved it. "The audience," Al said, his voice gaining strength and focus, "laughed because you gave them permission to dismiss serious work as a punchline. You turned my artistic commitment into entertainment for people who don't understand what it costs to create truthful performances." Al stepped closer to Niven, not threatening but commanding, his presence suddenly filling the space around them in a way that made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. "Let me tell you about volume, David," Al continued, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous. "When I played Frank Serpico, I didn't just raise my voice because I thought it would sound dramatic. I raised my voice because I spent months understanding what it feels like to be the only honest man in a corrupt system." The backstage area had gone silent except for the distant sounds of the ongoing celebration. Everyone within earshot was listening to what was rapidly becoming the most passionate defense of artistic integrity in Oscar history. "I rode with undercover narcotics officers in New York, David. I watched deals go bad, I saw people die, I learned what it costs psychologically to risk everything for principles that nobody else seems to care about. That's not volume for effect, that's emotional truth." Al's voice was building now, not getting louder but gaining depth and resonance, carrying the kind of controlled power that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. "And when I played Michael Corleone, I didn't just practice looking intense. I spent 2 years learning how good men become monsters through the choices they make. I understood what it costs to destroy your soul to protect your family." Niven opened his mouth to respond, but Al was building momentum, his passion for his craft becoming more evident with every word. "You want to talk about formulas, David? Let's talk about your formula. 40 years of playing the same charming British sophisticate, delivering witty observations written by other people, never risking anything real or challenging audiences to feel anything uncomfortable." The attack was surgical, targeting not just Niven's career but his entire approach to performance. Several people in the surrounding group shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Al had turned Niven's criticism back on him with devastating precision. "You mock intensity because you've never experienced it," Al continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You dismiss passion because you've never risked your sanity for a character. You reduce commitment to comedy because you've never understood what it means to disappear completely into another person's psychology." Niven's famous composure was beginning to crack, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching discomfort. This wasn't the gracious acceptance of public mockery he'd expected from a losing nominee. "Al, really, I think you're overreacting," Niven managed, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "Overreacting?" Al asked, his eyes never leaving Niven's face. "You publicly humiliated me in front of my peers and 50 million viewers, reducing my life's work to a volume joke, and you think I'm overreacting?" Al moved even closer, close enough that everyone watching understood this was no longer a public conversation but something more personal and dangerous. "Here's what I think is really happening, David," Al said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to everyone listening. "I think you see actors like me, actors who are willing to risk everything for truth, and it makes you uncomfortable because it reminds you of what you've never been brave enough to attempt. The silence that followed was profound. Niven stood frozen, perhaps realizing that he'd attacked not just an actor but an artist who was willing to defend his work with the same intensity he brought to his performances. "You want to know the difference between what I do and what you do?" Al asked, his voice gaining power again. "I transform. You perform. I risk my psychological stability for authentic characters. You deliver safe, predictable charm that never challenges anyone to think or feel anything real." Al looked around at the faces watching them, taking in entertainment journalists, industry executives, and other actors who were witnessing something unprecedented in Oscar history. "And tonight, in front of the entire industry, you proved which approach has more lasting value. Because 50 years from now, people will still be studying Frank Serpico and Michael Corleone, trying to understand how an actor created such psychologically complex characters." Al paused, letting his words settle over the silent backstage area. "But nobody will remember David Niven's witty presentation about volume, because wit without substance is just noise, and noise is exactly what you accused me of making." The devastation was complete. Niven stood speechless, his earlier confidence entirely shattered. Several journalists were frantically taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing one of the most powerful artistic manifestos ever delivered at an awards ceremony. Al straightened his bow tie with deliberate care, his movement controlled and dignified. "Thank you for the opportunity to clarify the difference between entertainment and art, David. I hope the audience understands now why some performances are worth remembering and others are just harmless fun." With that, Al turned and walked away, leaving behind a group of people who had just witnessed something unprecedented, an artist refusing to accept public humiliation and instead transforming it into a masterclass on what serious commitment to craft actually means. The story of Al's backstage confrontation with David Niven spread through Hollywood faster than wildfire. By the next morning, entertainment journalists were calling it the most powerful defense of method acting ever delivered. Industry professionals who'd witnessed it firsthand described it as a watershed moment in the relationship between serious artists and celebrity culture. David Niven never made jokes about Al Pacino again, and his subsequent Oscar presentations were notably more respectful toward nominees who didn't win. In private conversations, he would admit that the encounter had taught him an important lesson about the difference between wit and cruelty. Al never spoke publicly about the incident, but his career choices in the following years suggested that the exchange had clarified something important about his relationship with an industry that sometimes confused popularity with artistic merit. The 1974 Oscars became legendary not for who won awards that night, but for the moment when one of America's greatest actors proved that sometimes the most important performances happen not on screen, but in defense of the craft itself. And while Al Pacino didn't win an Oscar that night, he earned something more valuable: the respect of everyone who understood that true artistry requires not just talent, but the courage to defend that talent against anyone who tries to diminish it. Years later, when film students studied the history of method acting and its place in American cinema, Al's backstage response to David Niven would be cited as a defining moment, proof that great artists don't just create memorable characters, they become them when defending the integrity of their life's work.